So welcome everyone to our Community Economies Research Network meeting that we have online roughly once every quarter of the year. We're members of the Community Economies Research Network and also our Centre for Sustainable Communities in University of Canberra that co-hosts these meetings gather. Really lovely to have a diverse group of people and interests and experiences here in the room. Shang is going to be talking about her PhD, and she's going to give some reflections herself on her own past experiences and what's led her to this. So I won't introduce her formally, I'll let her do that. But I just want to begin with an acknowledgement, as we do in the Australian context, of country and of the First Nations peoples of the places where we are coming together from today. So I'm joining you from the edge of Ngunnawal country, that borders Gundungurra country, about an hour from Canberra in Australia. And I am acknowledging not only the country here that sustains me in my life and communities around me, but also the First Nations and countries where you are joining us from today. So Shang, I'm going to pass over to you, and I think Shang's going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. If you are really good at multitasking, and you can put questions or comments in the chat to prompt us as we go, that would be great. But if, like me, you find that a bit challenging and you just want to make a few notes, we'll open it up for questions after Shang has had her time of speaking. And she has some prompts for us at the end that link her talk to community economies research. So we really welcome your thoughts and your own experiences. Prior, have I missed anything?
That's all good, but
Okay.
yeah, we're supposed to just say a few words, introduce ourselves, but maybe
I think we
when
might do
we
that
ask
as
a
a
question.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking we'd throw to Shang, and then
Yep.
once we open up for discussion, we can just do a quick go round and introduce ourselves. So
Great.
Thank you for that reminder. Okay, Shang, over to you.
Thanks.
And I'll just mute myself.
Okay, thanks so much, Anne, for this really wonderful introduction, and really for the opportunity. Thank you so much for the Community Economies Research Network in Asia. Thanks so much, Prior, for facilitating this. I am really honored to be able to share with you my research topic this afternoon. Afternoon still there, maybe morning for right. Okay, I'd like to share about my topic, which is living with risk, an exploration of how Mindanao farmers in conflict vulnerable areas experience and navigate precarity. So I'm a first year PhD student here at the University of Canberra, and like Anne, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Ngunnawal people, and I'd also like to acknowledge the different indigenous groups back home. I also, home is Philippines. Yes, I also belong to the Center for Sustainable Communities here in Canberra. Okay, so for my presentation, I'd like to talk about, I'll give a brief background about myself and the projects that led me basically to this research that I am pursuing right now. And I'll also discuss about the broad question of what it is I'd like to find out, and a brief look at the literature on, what is it that we know so far on this particular topic of risk. And I'll delve specifically on the questions that I'd really like to find out, the answers I'd like to find out, and how will I go about finding the answers to these questions. I'll discuss my methodology, and then zero in on the significance of this topic, meaning why does it matter, and the so what of it all, and finally, how does this research relate to community economies scholarship. So to start, yes, people usually call me Shang, because of my full name, Shangrila. I did my master's and undergraduate both in sociology, and I have taught at this, if you can see the photo on your left, that's the picture of our university. Rai and I taught there for some time, like more than 10 years. We were we've been teaching at the Department of Social Sciences. My research interests are mainly in gender, prostitution, reproductive health, sexuality education, and then I got into social capital research and violent extremism. And then thankfully, I was able to attend here the Seeds of Change conference where I met Anne. And that's why I'm here, because I followed her. And I fortunately got the John Allwright Fellowship, which enabled me to study a PhD. Otherwise, I won't be able to, because it's a very expensive a program. So the projects that led me to this research are really based on the agro-extension model project that we developed in conflict areas in Mindanao that was funded by ACIAR, or the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. And that was an 8-year project that eventually was also promoted by Picard, and they funded another project for that, because they have been our companion in doing the ACIAR project, and they saw the value of the model. So we replicated that, and at present, ACIAR is again funding this particular model in Fiji. We'll check if this model will work in Fiji. And it's the same idea of applying it in a conflict setting. So given that background, so I've been thinking about, what are the different things that I have found myself really being interested in, and I've been doing in my research. And one common thread that I sort of find in the different researches that I've done is the concept of risk. When I look at prostitution, for example, reproductive health, violent extremism, and even farmers in conflict areas, I really see the importance of the concept of risk. So I'd like to find out how farmers in conflict vulnerable areas of Mindanao. Mindanao is the southernmost part of the Philippines, as you can see in this map. How do they define, understand, and deal with risk? So that's basically the general idea of the research. Now, if we look at Mindanao, yes, Mindanao is always associated with conflict, because there are different kinds of conflict basically in the area. And then you'll find what sort of conflict, violent conflict that involves state and non-state actors. Sometimes clan wars, we call it rido, and also especially land, conflict that's very prominent there. So in these communities, I've encountered a lot of farmers, and one of the things that I noticed is that they, of course, farmers make do with what they have, and there are so many, despite the different challenges that they face. And one of these, as you can see in the photo, is this experience of drought. They have months of drought, and that really made it hard for them to produce food, even just for their own consumption. So production was so low that they resort to eating this particular root crop. It's called kayos, and so it thrives even in these very dry conditions, but it's very poisonous if you don't know how to prepare it well. So these farmers do it well. So apart from that particular kind of risk that they encounter, like the environmental risks and the conflict, farmers also encounter really everyday life, different forms of conflict, different forms of risks. They encounter, for example, as I mentioned, the risk of violence, the risk of being harassed there. There's also the financial risks that they encounter, the market risks. It doesn't, like, for example, when farmers come across very low prices when it comes to, because they are, again, trapped in this debt credit, loop that they can hardly get out of. And so finances are really scarce for them. So that's part of the risks that they encounter. So I think Bancroft really summed it up very well in describing what risk is like in the Philippines, in that it's an everyday experience, and it becomes, the cultures now become a product of adaptation by these communities to these phenomena. through processes that permit the incorporation of threat into daily life, or what can be called the normalization of threat. I did encounter this personally when one of the communities where I did some workshop, and some bombs were going off, in a nearby community, and we're hearing them, and the and the people in the women, especially in my in that workshop, I was asking them, how are you feeling with all these bombs going off? We were so scared. The driver was already ready to. He opened the van already, because he thought we'll jump into the van just in case. But the women there, they just said that they can even tell you what kind of bomb goes off, and it's just part of everyday life. They even said it's music to their ears, which again points to the normalization, this desensitization of what's happening to them. And of course, that's a very alarming way of life, right? And so what is it that we really we have found? That's the context. The one I discussed to you is the context of the communities that I'd like to look into. But what is it that the literature has discussed so far in terms of this concept of risk? Well, if you look back at the idea of risk, the term risk, for example, they said that it can be traced back to merchants deliberating on the cost and benefit of the transactions they were conducting. And for Ewald, for example, he said that it can be traced really to maritime insurance, where the perils of sea voyage are very high. Later on, in the social sciences, for example, Beck and Giddens, I think are the more prominent writers on risk, and they discussed risk at the macro level. And again, for example, Beck was talking about this transition into a risk society. If you recall, famously, he said poverty is hierarchic and smog is democratic, right? Alluding to the idea that the former risks that we encounter, like class-based risk, for example, brought about by inequality and different kinds of inequalities, for example, are slowly diminishing. And what becomes more prominent is the systemic risk that's being experienced by everyone. That's why he said, smog is democratic, because even if you're really rich, it's a planetary threat. You've got nowhere else to go, basically. So and precarity is, as I've mentioned, this was really discussed more by Beck and Giddens. And then this can be traced through the evolution of the twin processes of ontological insecurity, as we can see, right? Especially with the technological, advances that are happening, and reflexive subjectivity analyzed by social theorists in the 90s as the cornerstones of technologically accelerated capitalism. As you can see about this threat, for example, of nuclear war, what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. Other studies, for example, in the social sciences that talked about risk as well, is that of Mary Douglas and Waldibski, who talked about risk more as a in relation to culture. And they look at risk in terms of the culture that produced this particular kind of the particular perception of risk that people have is dependent on the kind of culture where they belong to. So they came up with a grid type typology, of risk. And I think I'd like to follow this form of framework on, a more cultural theory bent on the study of risk. And more recent studies on risk focus on systemic risks and climate risk adaptation, as we know. So systemic risks include, for example, financial risks, it's like the financial crisis and the collapse that's happening. That happened, for example, in 2007, 2008. Now in the Philippines, Bankoff has done a lot of studies on risk, but these were mainly focused in Luzon and in the Visayas. So to summarize, there are different approaches to the study of risk. So it started out as a individual scientific technical approach, which is more of a realist approach in the sense that it's looking at the individual and how the individual evaluates risk on the basis of reason or cost benefit analysis, like, an individual rationally calculates these things. But of course, over time, research has shown that it's not so much cost benefit analysis as much as, it's the affect, really. It's the emotions that influence the way people make decisions, even if rationally this should be the choice that people make. People don't really take that choice. They do something otherwise, again, because of the influence of the emotions. So there's a huge literature as well that focus on that. Another set of literature that studied on risk, as I mentioned, is more on the macro level. So that's Giddens and Beck, and also the psychometric cultural, like they combine, for example, the studies on the individual, and that's using psychometry, and the cultural side of it. And one of these is using the social amplification of risk framework. That's one way of looking at it. And then there are other approaches, more recent ones as well, like the sociocultural mainstream, again, taking a look at culture. And another interesting development trajectory in terms of the study of risk is governmentality. Of course, this, as I think you all know, this has been developed from the ideas of Foucault. It's the idea that it's not enough, this new way of governing. It's not enough to just simply base this on the obedience of those who are ruled, but rather it's in the harnessing of individuals' own ability to rule themselves. So there is this idea of this transfer to the individuals to actually manage themselves. And in this sense, risk becomes for Ewald, it becomes a form of control. It's a moral technology in that it prompts the individual to manage themselves, and the blame also rests now either on the individual or the household. For example, if they did not take the measures to mitigate risk, like for example, if they did not get a health insurance, or their car has not been insured, etc. So it's becoming more and more individualized in that sense. So while Beck argues, for example, that the old forms of risk, class, gender, etc., they are diminishing. In fact, he said it's like dissolving. The case really isn't. When you read authors such as Dean Curran, for example, Nicholas Rose, they say that these inequalities are obviously still here, and in fact these class inequalities intensifies the risks that are experienced by individuals. So in summary, that's the different approaches that we have now in terms of studying risk. So what are the gaps? Well, the gaps in the literature points to the focus usually solely on production risk, and neglecting other types of risks. What other types of risks? Well, these include, for example, risks such as a personal risk, institutional risk, market risk, personal risks, like for example, the death of farmers, or the policies that are not institutional policies that are not pro-farmers, like in the case of the Philippines, the rice trade liberalization law. So all of these things are usually not recognized in the literature, because the focus is more on production. And if they are recognized in the literature, most of these studies make use of quantitative methods. And so there is this need for a highly descriptive study, which takes into account, for example, ethnographic methods to do that. And also, well, studies about conflict abound in Mindanao. Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it has been really well researched in terms of what kinds of conflict are there, the experience of conflict of people there, experience of displacement. Not much has been done in terms of the study of risk and precarity. And for those studies that have been done on risk, they're focused in Visayas and Luzon. So there is this particular research gap that I'd like to fill in. So in filling in this gap, these are the specific questions I would like to pursue. In the discussion, I would really appreciate if you can point out as well if these are good questions to ask, or like you can suggest more, or maybe I should delete some. Okay, so what types of risks do farmers experience? Which of these risks takes salience over others, and why is this so? And how is risk distributed? How is the experience of conflict and the risk it entails embodied in the decision-making of farmers living there? What ethical negotiations do they make, for themselves and for others as well? Like how do they reconcile certain things? Because sometimes you would observe contradictions, right? So how do they resolve these things, given that they're living in a very precarious situation? And so what strategies, including indigenous strategies, because the farmers that I'd like to do research with a lot of them are coming from different indigenous groups. So what strategies do they employ individually? So I'm not just concerned at the individual level, but also at the collective level. What are their different strategies, especially in building resilience? Again, a problematic term, but yeah, I also would like to interrogate that term. And so I'd also like to find out what does surviving well, or what does a good life really mean for them? So given these questions, these are the ways that I want to I'm thinking of doing how to answer those questions. So the philosophical paradigm that informs my research is a transformative one. I really subscribe to the idea that research should be relevant and can be really useful in making especially indigenous peoples and other marginalized sectors of society, making their lives a bit better. So the theoretical perspectives I'm thinking of also integrating is the pantayong pananaw, which roughly translates into from us, for us perspective, and Psikolohiyang Pilipino, or Filipino psychology. So these two perspectives are a product in the 1960s, 1970s, when people in the University of the Philippines, the academics there, proposed these particular perspectives in response to the Western, colonial framework that we are always using in universities, and they promoted this as a response to that, to use the Filipinos' own perspective. So that's why it's from us, and also to have the Filipinos as the primary readers. That's why it didn't really gain much mainstream prominence, because most of the literature that has been produced were written in the Filipino language. And as I mentioned, cultural theory of Mary Douglas, I'd really like to integrate that in this particular perspective. Now, in terms of the design, even if I have this idea already of how I'll go about, which is sequential, I'll show it in my next slide, but I want this to be a truly participatory kind of research. So I'd like to co-design this with my research participants. And then I'll do the different kinds of methods, which I'll elaborate in the next slide. So as I mentioned, it's sequential, meaning
Shang, can I just interrupt you? I should have given you a time check. I'm sorry about that, but that's 20 minutes. So what I'm going to suggest is that we allow you to go for another few minutes, maybe up to 5 minutes.
Okay, sure. Right. It's almost, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, yeah, so I'll be going through the different phases. Each phase basically informs the next phase of the research. So I'll do creative workshops, which means either photographs or videos, or depending on what's available in the community, what access do they have to technology, or it could just be, you know, drawing, etc. And then quantitative survey, qualitative using in-depth interviews, and I'll be using Atlas TI and SPSS as my analysis software. So the research timeline is there. I'll do my fieldwork next year. Hopefully I'll do my confirmation in February. And then, yes, why does it matter? Because there's a gap, as we've seen, in terms of, especially in qualitative research and in understanding risk, specifically in Mindanao as well. And of course, on a practical level, I'd like this research, the results of this, you know, to be utilized by project managers and policymakers, you know, to design interventions that are really appropriate and specific to the communities that they work with. And also to challenge the notion of expertise. You know, what do we mean by, because a lot of the research on risk perception checks the risk perception of farmers vis-a-vis that of experts. Like, who do we consider as experts? Like the climate change experts, the academics, etc. You know, so I'd like to contribute to that, you know, to that literature that puts forward really the validity of especially indigenous knowledge and farmers' knowledge, you know, and a response to the ongoing, you know, onslaught of capitalism and fascism, basically in the Philippines that's happening. And where do I place this? In the community economies scholarship. Yes, I'd like to engage with studies on resilience, surviving well, and survivance. Also to contribute to a place or community-based indicators and understandings, and to contribute to co-designed kinds of research. And also the post-qualitative research methodologies, thanks to Catherine for pointing this out to me as well. Yeah, I'm really interested to delve into that. And also, you know, comes to ethical relationships and negotiations. And that's why I'm ending this talk with my, these are my concluding thoughts. A shout out to both Carrie and Monty for reading with me Karen Barad's Meeting the Universe Halfway. I think I really like the idea of putting ethics, you know, there at the center of whatever it is that we do. And so I'd like to commit to practicing a reflexive, iterative, and dialogic process, because I believe that, you know, whatever we do, there are ethical implications. So I'll just read this last line from Karen Barad. So interacting responsibly as part of the world means taking account of the entangled phenomena that are intrinsic to the world's vitality and being responsive to the possibilities that might help us and it flourish. Meeting each moment, being alive to the possibilities of becoming, is an ethical call, an invitation that is written to the very matter of all being and becoming. We need to meet the universe halfway, to take responsibility for the role that we play in the world's differential becoming. Thank you so much. And these are the discussion prompts that I leave for our discussion part. Thank you so much for your time. And
wow, thank you so much, Shang. It's quite a lot for us to digest. So that's great. The last part had lots of slides with lots of things for us to think about. So thank you so much. So you've got a couple of questions there for us to think about, but you've also got some prompts on the previous slide about ways in which your work connects with community economies work, right?
yeah.
So that's really helpful for us. People might ask you to go back to that other slide as well. So you might want to stop sharing your screen at the moment, and maybe you can put your questions in the chat space for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
So as Priya mentioned at the start, what we often do in these meetings is just go around and say who we are and perhaps where we're joining from. And because we're doing that after Shang's presentation, it might be an idea just to mention one thought, if you have one. If you don't, it's not compulsory, but one thought that you have that you just sparked your own thinking while you were listening to Shang. So just one kind of initial reflection before we dive into questions. So I will start, if you like, just to set the pace, not put anyone on the spot to begin. So I am Anne Hill, and as I mentioned at the start, I'm joining you from about an hour away from Ngunnawal country on Gundungurra country, an hour from University of Canberra's Centre for Sustainable Communities, where I work, and also a long-time member of the Community Economies Research Network, and really pleased that we have this group, this space of discussion. And one thought that came to me, well done, Shang, on that, putting that all together ahead of your confirmation early next year, was when you had the diagram, the sort of matrix, the collective corner was blank, and I kind of thought that was really interesting, and potentially a space where you and your links to community economies work might have something to say that actually adds to that space that was blank in that typology. So that's just one initial comment. I've got some few other thoughts, but that's just one thing that came to mind. What about you go next, Prior, because you're on the side of my screen.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Par Placino. I'm based in Bangkok. I'm a postdoc researcher at Thammasat University and also at Western Sydney University. Thank you, Shang, for this very interesting presentation. And I'm very interested in how you would also kind of look at the, how different actants in Latourian terms, not just humans, but also non-human species and natural elements could be sort of like seen as co-producing all things, including risk as well as resilience make their everyday lives. Thank you. Isaac, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Isaac, and I'm also based at Western Sydney University, doing postdoctoral research on an ACIAR project at the moment. Congratulations, Shang. It's very, very well developed work that you're doing, and I'm sure your confirmation is not going to be a problem for you. You really have a very strong grasp on what you're doing, and there were many things to unpack there. For me, I guess I'm interested particularly in what are the ethical dynamics that come into play when we talk about how risks are evaluated. And another thing that Catherine's work has done, the community economies literature has spoken of ethical coordinates in economic decision making. But I'm thinking, what about ethical coordinates in risk evaluation from a place-based perspective?
Great that this is being recorded, Shang, because you'll be able to go back through some of these excellent comments. Perry, you're next on my screen. And I see you finished eating your lunch now, so.
I have, yes. I'm Kerry. I'm also at Centre for Sustainable Communities, where I'm doing PhD, and CERN member. And nice one, Shang. Really liked it. I'm wondering a few things. One's really boring, so I almost don't want to even mention it, but I will anyway. But it's not that boring. A lot of people say co-design, and I'm wondering how much you've thought about what that co-design looks like, or if it's just a bit more of a tentative plan at the moment. That would be interesting, particularly if you're going to take up any of Prior's comments there about the way that agencies that are not human might be implicated in risk and resilience and surviving well as well. I guess that's an interesting thought, actually. And maybe the other thing I was thinking, if you could talk a bit more about the link. I know there's an obvious link there, but it seems like you focus a lot on risk, and then at the end you say, oh, but I'm also interested in surviving well. And obviously there's a connection, of course, but maybe if you could, I'm just wondering, to me, they just seem like two separate things that have been put in as opposed to intertwined, I suppose. yeah, that's all for me.
So Shang, I'm keeping track of some of the questions, and maybe we can put some of them together so that you're not feeling like you've got to have a half-hour response to everybody putting you on the spot. It's kind of generative discussion, I think. So Catherine, you're next on my screen, and then Rai, and then Jin, and then Monty. You are at the center of my screen, so you get the last say of introduction.
Thanks, Anne, and thank you, Shang. And I'm sorry I was late. I was sitting here waiting for the thing to pop up, and yeah, I missed it. So I was 10 minutes late to join. I'm sorry. So I missed the beginning, but I caught the end. And oh, hi everyone. I'm sorry because I know Shang and I met with her just earlier this week, but I think I know most of you. I'm Catherine McKinnon, and I'm a member of the Community Economies Research Network, have been for yonks as well, and also based at the University of Canberra Centre for Sustainable Communities. But I was listening to the last half of your talk, Shang, and I'm just really struck by the quote that you chose to finish on, and that, yeah, really beautiful. I actually took a screenshot of it because I wanted to be able to look it up again in Brad's work. Because the last time we met, we were talking about methods, and we were talking about grounded theory as a method. And it occurs to me that the language you used in that last slide is a much better way to capture the method, I think, right? Because it's about the ethics and the ethical responsibilities. And yeah, just got me mulling over what does it mean to take responsible interacting as method? Yeah. So that was a really nice prompt. Thank you so much.
Great. Rai, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself, and if you have any initial thoughts for Shang? I know that you know each other well.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Sige, I'll open my camera if it's okay with it. Yeah. Actually, I'm here to give a moral support for Shang on many different levels. But yeah, indeed, after listening to her presentation, we've been talking about this. There are just some things, like, for example, she said farmers. So what popped up into my mind is that, who are these farmers? Is she going to categorize it as children, farmers, women? Also, the gender aspect considered as well, and also some categories of really trying to bring about the ethno part of it. No, kasi she will be using Mary Douglas, so very culture specific. So the categories of how people view these things and how is it related? Is it nature, related to nature, risk related to nature, risk related to economies, risk related to, and all this guy. But after that, she will be doing this when the data is there already, when she can see the categories and the abstraction side of it. But yeah, well done, Shang. Yay. I already volunteered that I'll be her research assistant when she comes back, if I'm here. Yeah, thank you very much, Anne.
Great. And it's lovely to meet you, Rai, because of our connection with the special issue, but also Rai is going to be attending one of the Liviana sessions. So it's really great that you've made a connection with all these people in the room, many of whom will also be at that conference online. So it's great. Jim, your turn.
Hi, good morning, Sam. Congratulations. Hi, everyone. Happy to meet all of you again, all of you. My name is Jane. I'm a third-year student at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and I'm actually tuning in from Eastern Visayas. I'm also in the Philippines and currently doing my field work. And I'm really impressed with this presentation because I think it reflects some of the findings that we recently uncovered with a review that I just shared in the comment. I'm not sure, just like what Ryan mentioned, I'm not sure what particular farmers are you referring to or how you're going to categorize it. But in the context of the Philippines, so farmers could be farming coconuts, rice, corn, and different crops. So I think it's interesting to look into this. I'm particularly also interested on how you incorporate the burgeoning or emerging literature of compound and cascading risk, particularly in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, in relation to the climate and the conflict setting or context in Mindanao. So, like other participants, I'm also looking at how how your data will reveal whether they also consider risk in terms of aging for the farmers, how they look at it from the well-being of their family farming as well as community as a farming community. Right? So these are just top of the head comments right now, but I'm really happy to continue the conversation. And looking forward to hopefully meeting you in the Philippines sometime. Thank you.
Thank you. And Monty.
Thanks, Anne. I'm Monty. I'm here at the CSC, and yeah, I've been here on Ngunnawal country for a little while, and I'd just like to start by saying congratulations to Shang. It was really good. I guess we've had a few different conversations, but to actually sit down and hear the whole thing together makes me really excited. And I don't have a question so much as just I'm really curious and excited to see how, and kind of maybe extending off prior was saying how that Laturian kind of sort of the risks blend together and tell that story. And so I'm really curious and can't wait to kind of see what kind of comes out of this and how that story is told. So yeah, I'm excited to see what happens and hear about your journey as you go.
So Shang, I'll just exercise my chair role and just synthesize a couple of things, because we've got about 15 minutes for discussion, which I think it's so fantastic that you've got all those reflections from people, because I think that'll really help you to think through some of the details of the, so rather than cover the specifics of who the farmers are and all those things now, I think this group of people can really help you think through a little bit of the question of ethics, so I think that's one that was common in a lot of questions that were raised. So the idea of ethical dynamics and the kind of connection to surviving well and risk, and surviving well with others potentially, which wasn't mentioned, but the discussion around ethics and risk and community economies work is one that perhaps we could have together a little bit more now. So there was a question of how different actants could be seen as producing risk, but then also there was a discussion about ethical dynamics and how potentially those different actants could be somehow engaged in not only producing risk, but avoiding risk or overcoming risk as a view to surviving well. So I think, Kerry, you questioned that idea of how does risk link to surviving well? What's the connection between those two things? So it's almost like the kind of way that ethics is thought about in community economies work, as I think you mentioned, Isaac, too, that there's coordinates, but we talk about them very much as negotiations, ethical concerns or ethical considerations. So one is that question of surviving well and how do we do that? What does surviving well look like? Another one is how do we survive well with others and what does that look like? So I'm going to put that forward as something that we might want as a prompt for discussion. So something around different actants and the role that they play in ethics that are about negotiating risk or precarity, if that makes sense. I mean, it's a bit much to take in, but think what's the connection between risk and surviving well with others, these ethical concerns of community economies. So Shang, would you like to go first with any thoughts, and then maybe other people can bounce off you?
Thank you so much, Anne, and thanks everyone. Really, I I am so indebted to you for making me think more about the questions that I'm also really interested in. I'm especially when it comes to ethics. And to be honest, thanks Kat for pointing me to the post-qualitative research methodologies and innovative methodologies there, because I found this book recently that seems really interesting to use for this one, although I haven't really read it much yet. So that's why I'm really interested in this idea of, because they are taking into account Barad, Latour, the agent actor network theory, etc. So I'm happy with the question on the ethical dynamics and how it can be, how will I write that really, we did talk about it in our reading club as well. Carrie, Monty, and I, we like the concepts, but I was also sharing with them that it's another thing to actually write about it. Like how did this go about, and especially taking into account other actants. I'm still grappling with that, to be honest. I haven't really considered the different non-human actants. Although I have that in the background of my mind, but I haven't really, brought it to the fore yet. I don't know how I can integrate that, because at the moment I am still I'm just thinking of farmers, but farmers, yes, like what sort of farmers. Of course, I definitely will look into the different dimensions of, gender, ethnicity, age. Those are going to be indeed there, and they are definitely in conflict vulnerable areas. So those are like the common elements that are present in choosing the participants. So yes. So in
any thoughts, Shang, on what Isaac called sort of the ethical dynamics of risk?
Yes.
Have you got any early thoughts on that? I know it's a big thing to sort of sink your teeth into right now with short notice.
I know. It's okay. And thank you so much for prompting that, because actually I've also been thinking really on the ethical implications of what I'll do in the field, and how does that, what sort of dynamics are we going to have in the field, with firstly the farmers, and also, I'm more interested as well on how they negotiate risk with themselves. As Carrie mentioned here, some may create risks for others, and that's true. In fact, in the surviving well, which again I'll just quickly answer also what Carrie said. Like, I mean, it seems like two separate concepts, risk and surviving well. But yes, they are definitely related, in the sense that I'll be looking at those strategies that they use in surviving well. So what sort of strategies, especially at the collective level. And yes, I've read some literature that indeed point out to negative coping strategies, if you like, or they would call it contradictory decisions or actions that come from, it could even be viewed as self-sabotaging, and that's interesting to see how, because of course, I mean, these people are in a survival mode. So it's interesting to see how do they negotiate, that with themselves, and what sort of ethical considerations, or do they, how do they weigh these things up in their head. So I think that's the sort of ethical negotiations that I would like to delve into.
Isaac, do you have a response?
Part of my response comes from actually the matrix that you showed as well, which is, you kind of seem to have a binary of subjective and collective thinking. And my understanding of, if we talk about being in common and those kind of things, is that we're actually, our subjectivities are collective and individual at the same time. So I think when you're asking those questions about risk, you can ask not just how do they negotiate that risk with themselves, but how do they negotiate it with others in practice, and actually with others in the moment when they are thinking about risk, that they are negotiating risk personally and collectively at the same time when they process these decisions and strategies. And another aspect of that came out in my work was the kind of tacit knowledge that's embedded in the everydayness, that everyday practices that people do, So maybe one of the other things to think about is how your work will amplify that and validate that and place, amplify and place more value on tacit knowledge and bring it more to the forefront of people's thinking.
Yeah.
I'd like to add on that, Isaac. Thank you for pointing out those everyday practices, because it really points, it's really related to the paper that we co-wrote as a group, the community economies keywords in Monsoon Asia. And I think with that prompt, Shang could, I'm sure you'll be able to kind of identify some of the place-based practices that people are really doing already in terms of surviving well among within families and with other people. For example, like how they use pakikisama. I'm more familiar with, let's say, in the Luzon context, but I wonder whether this would have equivalence in Mindanao and using their own languages.
Yeah, can I respond quickly to that, Anne? Yes, thanks so much, both Isaac and Prior, because indeed, I also would really, in fact, in that slide, sorry, I really hurried up. I said I'd like it to be a response to the onslaught of fascism and capitalism really that's happening in the Philippines. And that's where I'd like to place, tacit knowledge, especially that there's not much recognition on, the validity of indigenous knowledges and also, the different tactics, the everyday tactics that they use as well in surviving well. I'm really interested in, I look at that before in my prostitution research, using Bourdieu for Deserto's idea of tactics, and I'm really interested as well on how exactly farmers, do that in their own, context. Because as I said, there's a lot of contradictions that are happening as well, and how do they negotiate it with themselves and with others? And yes, and like at the moment, because it's different as well with the ones that you have at present and the ones like in the more futuristic way of looking at it, because a lot of the indigenous, well, the background of my comment on why this is a response is place-based understanding and collection of of these different understandings from the different indigenous groups, is that a lot of times they, especially with the Monsoon Asia that you mentioned prior, I really enjoyed that article and Catherine's article as well on gender-based indicator. I really like that, because I'd like to pull in local, local knowledge, local terms that they use. Because for example, in the literature, Japanese culture apparently doesn't have a word for risk. So does that, does that even enter the vocabulary of indigenous groups, and how do they construe risk? So I'm interested with that on that level, and as a political push really, because a lot of the practices now that are indigenous, collective practices, as mentioned by Prior, for example, pakikisama, and we have a lot of these like bayanihan, the collective labor, reciprocal labor, that's also slowly being eroded by the state, because these practices are seen as communist, are seen as rebels. And so they are, they're being harassed by, and so these things are slowly eroding. They are being replaced by more capitalistic forms of exchange. So that's where I am coming from. And
I just wanted to come back to the idea of ethics as well, and my own thinking over the years in the community economies work about the way in which our ideas about ethics have shifted. So very early work that I engage with in the community economies area used a sort of language of ethical decision making, and it was like this sort of coherence around making decisions. But I think some of the comments today and some of the more recent work that's been done in community economies scholarship over the last 10 years has shifted much more into the space of ethical negotiations around key concerns. And part of that is because there's a different view of ethics being operationalized, which is much more in the moment. So I think, Isaac, I thought it was interesting you were talking about tacit knowledge and embodied knowledge. And I keep thinking, Shang, that in your work, because people are already at the brink of surviving and just surviving, there's a sense in which the very embodied experience of actually living out different encounters with each other and with nature, with weather, with conflict, with like living in a terrain where they don't know if they're going to, you know, encounter bombs and people that don't, you know, aren't kind, political systems that aren't, you know, kind of embracing of them. So there's that constant feeling of the moment, the encounter, which is a different ethical space to a calculated decision. And I think the background you've had in terms of Australian government agricultural projects and agricultural extension positions risk in that discourse that you know, you talk about the Western discourse of risk, right? So you make calculated judgments, and you as a farmer can say, oh, this is a risk and that's a risk, and I can weigh this up and I can make all these decisions, which is a particular understanding of ethics. But there's a completely different understanding of ethics that's much more from what we'd call non-representational theory, where you are in the encounter, and that those others, those other actors, those other things that are with you, you know, whether it be the land itself, the trees, the spirits of ancestors, the collective of your tribe, you know, your indigenous people around you, your collective of women, all of those others actually are with you and moving in relationship to you and your ethical experience. So I think when you think about your risk and how people navigate risk, you're also then going to be thinking about this idea of a different notion of decision making, if you like, that's very much about the ethical encounters. So anyway, that's a long-winded reflection, but I think I was trying to pull together some of those threads that Prior and Isaac and Kerry and so on and Monty were kind of all sort of in a way playing with a little bit in Karen Barrad's work, maybe. Does anyone have any final wisdom before we close the session? Kerry?
I don't have any final wisdom, but I have a comment to make. Building just off what you were saying, Anne. As I fully support what you're saying, and it just something that I've been thinking about, and maybe is something you sort of think about as well, Shang. And we've probably spoken about it anyway in our reading group, but it's almost like there's an ontological mismatch between the literature and between what you might propose to do in the field. So you've got that literature that Anne was talking about, and that you've talked about, you know, the you know, agri extension kind of projects, et cetera. That and also, sorry, Isaac was talking about human agents making decisions about risk. So as opposed to risk being made. And I wonder how you stack those two up. I wonder for my own work as well, how you combine those two. How you get a literature that is based on a different understanding of the world to what you're trying to do. There might be something to think about.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, and I think the sense that the encounter, I mean, this takes me back to my own PhD research, but you know, if you look at thinkers like Lacan, right, there's the sort of the sense of the encounter, the event actually changes your disposition. So, you know, and you don't know that ahead of time. You suddenly are with other people or with non-human others, and they completely shift the way your own sense making of that next step occurs. So you don't always have that capacity to preempt what is going to happen next, you know. So you might learn habits and have a set of dispositions, but it will change. So, you know, that kind of then becomes like precarity becomes a possible condition of being, that you learn how to live with that precarity and that risk, and that you can survive well with the risks and precarity rather than it be something you have to somehow overcome, you know, which I think is part of a climate changing world disposition as well, you know, learning to live with those things. But yes, I realize I'm having the last word now, but I think I just want to say a huge thanks to you all for being part of this discussion and this meeting space. And it's just been really a great pleasure to be with you. I see Kimberly Thomas is just joining us. Hi, Kimberly. We're just about to finish the And I'm so sorry that you've just joined us for the end. So you'll be in a position to be able to listen to the wonderful recording that we've just made of this session.
Oh, shoot. Okay, I must have gotten the time difference wrong. I'm in Vietnam,
So sorry.
and
Yeah,
I'm
so
sorry to have missed it.
Before we go, would you like to just introduce yourself to us? Because we would love to hear how you've come to this session today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Urban Studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. And I'm in the Mekong Delta right now, looking at social and environmental drivers of outmigration from the Delta, which has been occurring, at a significant rate for the past 15 years or so. And so I was really interested in learning about this work on precarity and particularly from kind of a CERN network perspective. And so I'll have to tap into the recording. Sorry to have missed it.
Welcome to the Community Economies Research Network Asia, and there'll be some ongoing events, and hopefully perhaps prior you can send, if you could put your email or something in the chat space, or a way that we can reach you. We can keep you posted about subsequent things. And there will be a recording, and Shang, maybe you could even connect with Kimberly after this as well, so that you can have ongoing conversations with us. Yeah, and good luck with your research too.
Thank you so much.
Well, it was really great to see you all. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Some of you in the CERN conference in November.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
All the
much.
best.
Bye-bye.
I'll see you on the 3rd of November.
Yes,
Thank
Yeah.
see you. I saw there, yeah. Bye.
Shang, do you want to stay on just for a moment?
Sure, Anne. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yay, great.
Thank you, Anne. I really enjoyed the discussion, and thanks, Prior, for typing the contingent resilience, because yes, it is indeed very, very contingent to whatever it is you're facing at the moment. And yeah, it's a very helpful discussion, and yeah, honestly. Thanks so much.
And Prior, would you like to stop the recording as well?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh,
No
I almost forgot.